Well, hey, everybody, welcome to Undisciplined by Design. This is a show where we talk about creativity, innovation, and the interesting things going on in the world, despite a pandemic that's causing us to change the way we live and work and communicate and collaborate with each other. My name's Aaron Bradley. I'm the host, and I'm a faculty member at the University of Cincinnati. I teach classes on design thinking, innovation, and digital storytelling. And a lot of that gives me the opportunity to talk to really interesting people in the creative world who are thought leaders and are finding their way through this unique time as well and really paving the way for others. So my guest today is Erin Routson, and she, just from the little bit we've talked before, has a really interesting story and background and a lot of different things that that we might be able to talk about today. So Erin, I'm going to let you introduce yourself, who you are professionally, personally, and tell us a little bit about your story, and then we'll just go from there.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. It's nice to, get on Zoom with other people. It's nice to talk to other people. I feel like I've spent so much time in this room. So I am currently the Vice President of Creative Services at Universal Music Group, Ecommerce and Label Services, which is the longest job title I've ever had in my life.
Well, hey, academia likes long titles too, so it's not too bad. I get it, but it's a mouthful, right?
It's a mouthful. I have been in this. I started this position actually in quarantine, which has been very interesting in terms of working with teams and being able to figure all of that out. So a challenge on top of a challenge, I think. I'm based in Philadelphia. I've been in Philadelphia for almost 2 years now. I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, originally. Go Cavs, very much a thing for me. But I'm from Ohio originally, but have lived all over the country. I actually moved to Philadelphia from Los Angeles. Prior to Los Angeles, I was in New York. Prior to New York, I was in Cleveland and Columbus. Prior to that, I was in Atlanta, Georgia. And prior to that, I was in Cincinnati. So I've really made my way. I'm like an NBA player that gets traded every couple of years. And so I've been all over the country doing all sorts of different stuff.
All right. So you've fared well in the creative draft every season, huh?
Yes. I'm a journeyman. So I have been, I've been in in-house roles, currently obviously in an in-house position. I've worked at agencies. I came from agency before this. Spent a lot of time in the beauty industry. Also did a master's in design criticism at the School of Visual Arts in New York.
Okay.
Prior to that, had worked a few positions, Abercrombie and Fitch, which was actually, I had interviewed there to co-op as an undergrad at Cincinnati and later went back to work, after graduation. And yeah, truly have been all over the place. At this point, my friends joke that it's like 6 degrees of me because I have met so many people that it's one of those things that I feel like I can find a way that I'm connected to most people, which is freaky, but also kind of entertaining.
Right on. Yeah, no, that's fun. Well, especially when we all need things we can do over Zoom now, right? So that's a game we can play over Zoom. Right?
Yeah, good game. Fun game.
So, we made this connection initially because of you being a UC grad and people that were in common through that. But maybe just walk us a little bit through that. Like, what was your path to leaving Cincinnati as a DAAP grad and then kind of launching out into this really wild journey? Did you plan this kind of vision for yourself, or did one thing lead to another?
I absolutely
how did we get here?
I did not plan this vision in any way. That was definitely, I could not have planned that I would be in Philadelphia at this point. Not a place, I ever imagined living. Initially when I wanted to become a designer, I wanted to do album art. That was like the thing that I loved the most. I know I'm not alone as a designer in wanting to, pursue that path. And as I went through school and realized how unviable of a career prospect that became, just as digital music became more and more the norm, I kind of reconfigured what I wanted to do. I felt really fortunate. I will say one thing I often go back to is that I felt so fortunate at Cincinnati to do internships while going to school. Mm-hmm. I cannot tell you how many people I have recommended Cincinnati to, how much I usually want to hire Cincinnati grads for that reason. I just feel like you get this kind of experience that is so valuable to you when you graduate, which I definitely benefited from. When I graduated, I had experience. And so when I interviewed for positions, people knew I had already worked in an office. I knew, for example, the nitty-gritty of doing production art, all of these things that are such valuable skills that sometimes you don't learn until after graduation, I graduated knowing. So after graduating, I was just trying to find a job. And incidentally, a friend of mine had found a position in Atlanta. I went down there to visit. I really liked it. It was a place that I remember being at a gas station, filling up my rental car and thinking like, this is a place where I could live. And so I started looking for jobs there and ended up getting a position as an assistant art director for Goody hair accessories. This was pre-recession, so it was a great time. Got to do really amazing photo shoots, worked with a really amazing team. Very fortunate they gave me a long leash to work from. I was directing my own shoots. I was budgeting them. I was designing full lookbooks and doing press approvals. So really got to touch a lot of things. And I felt like that was in part because I came in with so much, previous experience and just worked with a team where that was really kind of the culture, was to be able to let people learn things while doing them. So that was a really good, I was there for about a year and a half and I got very homesick. I love Ohio very much. So I really wanted to come back. I knew quite a few people who worked for Abercrombie and Fitch, and I talked to a contact that I had there and ended up being able to interview, ended up accepting a position, moved back to Ohio in 2008, and approximately 9 months later lost my job in the recession. So a crucial learning moment for me was the recession. And I can't tell you how much I think about that now. While, anytime there's an economic downturn, I think creative positions are viewed as expendable. I remember being in the office of Ohio Job and Family Services and crying, and this poor job counselor saying to me, like, there really are no jobs for you. I was young. I worked in retail at that time, so it was tough. It was really tough and kind of realigned how I thought about my job path, again, what we're talking about here and what I thought I was going to be doing. So I decided I wanted to go back to school.
Okay. Well, that's a common thread sometimes. Like recessions are really good for the, the business of schools, right?
Yes. I cannot tell you the proliferation of creative MFA programs due to the recession, I think, but all valuable in their own ways, but so many niche MFAs that I never saw, one of which I participated in. So I had always thought I would go to law school after design school, which is in part, I think I got a little disillusioned. I've always had like a social justice activist bent to my life. And I felt that law school would be a way to really act on that. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, there was a master's program at SVA being kicked off in design criticism, which I saw an old friend. I feel like a lot of these things are, I see an old friend and this old friend plants a seed in my brain and then that comes to life in some way. And he said, I can't believe you would resist doing a criticism MFA. That's like your hobby. Why wouldn't you want to do it?
Okay.
I hemmed and hawed a little bit and I wasn't really sure what it would be. Like what does design criticism mean? I've sat through many crits. I've been a designer a long time, but I didn't fully understand kind of what that would mean for my career. Would it mean I wasn't a designer anymore? Would I be a design writer? What does that look like? But, times were tough. Yeah. And I felt like it was a way that I could talk about a lot of things that I was interested in through the lens of design and be able to do 2 very luxurious years of research, which I love so much. Okay. And feel like that research, I had that bent before, and that bent just was like intensified by doing that program. And I always push my teams now to really do research on whatever they're working on. It just helps you so much, when you're going through the work. I'm no expert, but I know how to do some good research and dig up the information that I want. Yeah. So I moved to New York to pursue this and spent 2 years working through a master's in design criticism. And my thesis project was on public housing in the United States. Something that I had no personal experience with. I, grew up middle class, but was always interested in the design work that goes into a system like that. Yes. So I ended up working through that, but at the same time got to write all the time about design topics. And I have a very loose definition of what design means.
Mm.
So I spent my time writing essays about, the design of rap videos and how class ascension can be shown in a rap video.
Right on.
I,
Yeah.
I was ready to bring it all in and make it all design because I thought
Yeah.
that to me was the only way to approach it. I at this point, it had so much design history. I knew all the chairs. I knew all the architects. I had been through a lot of that. And it was great. I had classmates that had never done any of that work. So they were super interested in those avenues. And I was basically trying to just expand the definition of design while I was there.
Yeah.
So as you can imagine, I graduated and there's no clear career path for what you do after you do that at all.
Yeah.
But I stayed in New York.
Okay.
I actually ended up getting a full-time position at L'Oreal. So I was back in the biz, back doing packaging, very different from, 2 years of luxurious thought about public housing.
Yeah. No more, class ascension through existential. Yeah.
No. Now I was just helping to package expensive fragrance, which, has its own merits. So I spent about 2 or 3 years doing that. What was amazing about it is that not only did I get to work for one of the biggest beauty brands in the world and see how all of that worked and see what the creative process was on that level, I got to also travel the world with that job. Very fortunate. I would go to Asia for a month to supervise packaging approvals, supervise color runs. I would be in, a Chinese factory thousands of miles from my own home. I was, the only blonde person in the room, but really, basically got my skull blown off all the time by all the stuff I was seeing and was amazed just to be outside in the world. And now that feels even further away than ever, honestly, but, got to go to China, got to go to Japan, got to go to Korea, all of this because of just a very cool job. But as I am wont to do, I was ready for something else and I wanted to move to Los Angeles. So I plotted my move, ended up moving there, got a job in the beauty industry, worked for a few beauty industry companies there, and really became, that I think is really when I reached the point that I became like a design manager and a person who grows people. And really became almost more interested in the organizational culture of designers than doing the design work itself. Okay. And I feel like that's really the path that obviously now with this role I'm now on, but that was where I started to kind of tap into that. And I think that managing creative teams is a particular skill, and creative people, obviously, I think so many people are amazing. There are so many amazing designers in the world. I think there are very few. I think as you move up, it's harder and harder to become a really good design manager or a creative director or design director. Because I remember, I will tell you, my first internship when I was at Cincinnati, I remember a very high up creative saying to me, Erin, the higher you get, the less design work you're actually going to do. That was mind blowing to me that you become the creative director and suddenly you're not the one doing it anymore.
Right.
So that is the path that I have now found myself on. I moved to Philadelphia for love. It's a thing I find shocking to say. But my boyfriend is from here. He wasn't going to leave Philadelphia, so I now live here. Okay. But I came to work here at an agency, and I had been in-house for a very long time. So it's kind of like the domesticated cat is out in the feral world then. And I learned a lot. Learned so much at an agency. A year and a half at an agency, again, was one of those things where I learned so much in such a short period of time. Very fortunate to have that experience again and got to work on my beloved Cleveland Cavaliers as a client there. It was a lesson in itself because sometimes you can love something so much and then it becomes your client and you have to, it's tough. It's a tough thing.
Yeah.
But then I made my way, now to UMG. This is such a long, circuitous story. I told you it would be. I've been all over the place. But now I'm at UMG as the senior creative person in my division and get to make all of those decisions about my creative teams and, what are we focusing on and who am I hiring and how are those teams working together? And that's a whole new level of problem solving. So it's
Yes.
like problem solving on top of creative problem solving to me.
Right.
But I feel like that so much of that problem solving thought came from my foundational work at Cincinnati. I feel like that I know so many other grads who feel similarly, like we were trained to be problem solvers. Our avenue to do that is creative.
Yeah.
So,
When what was your undergrad?
I was graphic design major.
Okay.
Back
Yeah. I
when,
mean,
back when it was still, I think it's not, I don't even think graphic design is a thing anymore. But
yeah, no, it's changed names 2 times since then. Yeah, but you probably did. You have Robert Probst as a professor?
I did.
Yeah, right on. Robert hired me, so I have Robert and I have a great like fun relationship history, and yeah, like you can usually by about this point in a conversation, I can tell when somebody was like, "Wait a minute, you probably had Robert as a professor, didn't you?" Just because of the way even that people that had Robert as a professor talk about what graphic design can do, and it's the language that you're using, you know.
Yeah.
So there's another Robert disciple here. I have to tell him. Yeah.
He and I got into it quite a few times about what constituted a musical genre for an icon system. So yeah, I learned a lot from him, a lot from all. I mean, that was like I feel like there's like a classic Swiss faculty at Cincinnati in the Gordon Salco era, and that was definitely my time there. And when I decided I wanted to go to law school, Gordon wrote me a recommendation letter that I still take out and read sometimes, just because he also sends you a copy on the side,
Okay.
which is amazing. Rest in peace. But sometimes I take that letter out to read it and reaffirm that like I've made the right decisions in my life post Cincinnati, cool. And that he saw that in me at that time.
Yeah.
But yes, definitely molded by that thinking. And it's so funny because now I have such a strong Swiss training and want so much alignment and want all of the classic Swiss typefaces are my go-tos. And now when I look at the work of my teams, it's very hard for me because I have to let that go. Like that's not how they see design work. It's not so. It has become more. There are so many more avenues now than it just being this like very Swiss, very regimented, very systematic. The grid, all of that has. In some ways, they throw that all away, which is interesting. It creates interesting work, but for me, at first, I have to check myself and remember that's not how everybody is educated anymore.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think that's one of the things. So one of the themes of the show is, we talk about the ways that the longer you get into your creative career, the more those lines start to blur, and defining yourself as a certain kind of designer becomes less and less advantageous, really.
Right.
You start to learn to take advantage of the things that you learned foundationally, but then steal parts or morph into other aspects of what other disciplines do, and sometimes those are in design and sometimes they're not even in design, right? And so I feel like you're describing kind of even an internal struggle of that, of like with the team that you're leading, we're like, oh, okay, you all bring all these different things to the table, and so for me to try and impose upon you like the way that I was trained as a designer is probably counterproductive, right?
Yeah, they don't want to hear it. No, that's not true. I think they just appreciate you have to appreciate there are so many approaches. After going through a very like hardline training, even it's hard. There are things, it's so funny. There are so many things that I see that are designed, and I think I admire that so much. I don't know if I could ever design that myself, just because I don't know if I can ever get that far away from, what my training has been and what my style has been over time.
Sure.
I think that one thing that has been good is in working in so many places and traveling all over the place. I feel like that helped push me in directions that, in many ways, but in directions that I wouldn't have thought in my path. I don't know if I think when I started off as a designer, and I think this is true for some people, I thought I would be hands-on in the weeds designing forever.
Mm-hmm.
That's really not the case. Oftentimes in my role now, I'm guiding creative work. I'm not the one doing it. I'm evaluating. The design criticism really comes in handy here. I'm working through a lot of people's projects, but again, doing a lot of creative problem solving that may or may not actually involve design work. Yes. Some of that is creative problem solving between teams and how they work together. Some of that, is how does something get done from a design perspective. But I think being able to having that, like, I think the term design thinking is thrown around so much now, but I think we were really trained that way to use that thinking across the board, no matter what we're doing. And that's in me forever. There's no way that that will change. And so maybe the avenues in which it comes out, that changes. But underneath, like, that foundational piece is very strong. So.
Yeah. Well, what are some of the kinds of things, it doesn't have to be a specific project, but, in your role now, like, what are you leading teams to do? What does a time frame look like? What's the scope of what you're trying to move the needle on, and what's the end result of it?
Yeah, so it's really interesting to be doing an e-commerce job at this time that e-commerce is really an option for people. So I work for Universal Music Group, who obviously owns a lot of major record labels that you and I have, all heard of.
Yeah.
And I'm helping those artists to build an e-com presence and essentially at this point be able to build an e-commerce business that can make up for lost tour revenue. I mean, that has been a major problem. So all touring has ceased.
Yep.
That's how so many musicians make their living. And so how do you build an e-commerce business and a merch business that can fill in the gaps on some of that?
Mm-hmm.
And how do you build a viable e-commerce business, merch business that is the artist believes in, the fan also believes in, and how do you make that connection between the artists and the fan? Mm-hmm. So really trying to bring that to life through a lot of different avenues, but a lot of merch and product design. And I have a team that does that. And we obviously work through a lot of projects together. And then, building websites to support that, which is honestly like where I started when I was a teenager. I had the internet early. I taught myself how to code. I would build websites all the time. My first freelance job through circuitous path, I was 16 and it was for Capital Nashville, which is now a label that is under my roster. So I've really come to circle at this point. And now I'm helping to build those websites or helping to help my teams build them. So really we're trying to solve that problem, which is how do we fulfill that like artist fan connection through a digital medium, through e-commerce, through live stream performances, through all of these things that are so different than going to a show, watching the band, buying the t-shirt and going home.
Yeah.
Records, like how do you create a digital record store shopping experience that is anywhere near what it is to go in a physical space and rifle through bins? How do you take those experiences and make them digital? Can they be digital? So being able to try to problem solve for that and figure out what is the way that we do that. Not something I ever saw myself doing, even though there's so much foundational stuff for me that would indicate that this is where I would end up.
Yeah.
Particularly after there was so much physical work done at Cincinnati. You were painting letters by hand. You were taking the 4x5 camera out and, covering yourself and shooting those and printing them in the darkroom. I had done so much packaging work in the beauty industry, so much tactile stuff, that this was a big adjustment, like being able to take those tactile experiences and then, move them digitally. But still making things, still making merch, still figuring out like what it is that, bridges that gap for the fan and the artist, what best serves them, what personally or not personally, what I want to wear, what do I think is cool, what trends are happening. So it is not the work I saw myself doing, but I do feel like this is the most interesting time to be doing it because the pandemic has forced so many of us into these spaces.
Right. Well, yeah. And so there's so much I want to unpack with this because partially because you wouldn't have known this. So I don't think we were even talking about this in the show that much. But so I left a teaching job when I turned 30 to go move to Nashville to play in a rock band and be in the music industry. It was a super logical life career choice. Thankfully, my wife was like super supportive and was like, no, you need to do this now or you'll always regret that you didn't. Right. Obviously, that's not where I ended up long term, but I was in the music industry for about, I guess, 3-4 years. And it's ultimately what led me back into the role that I have here. I was hiring interns from all of the local colleges here. I moved back to Cincinnati and was running a venue and I was hiring interns and I started going into classes and stuff. So again, that circular journey, right? But I was in the biz sort of and trying to make as an artist first. And then I was doing sort of, when that didn't pan out, I was doing more like kind of artist development coaching and like helping these young kids that had a dream and some talent, but were not anywhere near being like, nope, this is now a product that we have to sell, right? And it was right as the music industry it had already started to be disrupted, but really was starting to get turned on its head. And labels were dropping down to like, nope, we're only going to sign you for a one album development deal. And you actually have to come to us with it already recorded. We're just going to be the bank and the distribution, right? So there was no support of the creative process part of it. You had to come with all that done.
Yeah.
And I almost feel like now we're in this post digital era where it might have taken 20 or 30 years to get to the point where, okay, how do we sort of digitize or commoditize an experience that is no longer experiential? Mm-hmm. But now it just got accelerated down to like, okay, the last 9 months have been all about that, right?
Yes.
So the one encouraging thing that I've seen from it is that it's actually like made people be more thoughtful about not still trying to rely on old methods that weren't working anymore because they've just been taken away. I mean, that's happened in so many industries, but the music industry is such, I mean, I have friends that, yeah, if you were a lighting tech, you could have been the best lighting tech ever. You're not working right now,
right?
And you probably won't be for a while. So how are you going to take that skill and create an experience still that people want to participate in and feel involved in,
Exactly. And it's, I love music. I love live music. The fact that I was on a Zoom call, like a casual friend Zoom call the other night, and somebody asked what was the last live show you went to before this happened. And it's like hard to think about that in a way because it was so much a part of my life. Travel was so much a part of my life. And now I, spend most of my time in this room. So,
what was the show?
I went to see a band called, it was a friend's band was opening. They're called Youth Code. They're like industrial. Okay. And then they opened for Refused, who I actually had loved since I was in high school. So I was very happy to see them. But it was in New York. It was at a smaller venue. And now it's one of those things where, the more I hear about things closing and all of that, this is hard. This is really hard. I think it's hard for everybody. But to your point, all of those things that, were everyday jobs that were so much a part of that industry, just overnight, just gone.
Yeah.
That's really, in a way, it's an interesting time, like I said, to be in e-commerce, because that also happened to a lesser degree in the beauty industry while I was working in beauty, because what was brick and mortar, you would go to the counter and you would try things and all of that became something that was shoppable through Instagram. People built entire brands on Instagram.
Yeah.
And figuring out how, if I'm a major beauty player, how do I contend in that space when my business is being gobbled up by all of these, people with phones, essentially. Mm-hmm. So I'm glad we're having this conversation, because sometimes I don't even think of it this way, but so much of it is like, how do we problem solve that experience? How do I problem solve for fans, I myself being a fan? How do I come anywhere close to that experience?
Yeah.
What do we create to do that? And I think that we're capable of creating so many cool, amazing things. Billie Eilish did a crazy, fully produced live stream performance that was awesome. I mean, I would give anything to be in a room when that happened. But if this is the next best thing, I went to see Metallica, a pre-recorded Metallica performance at a drive-in theater.
Oh yeah, I saw they were doing that. Yeah.
Yeah. I was like, get me there. That's the closest thing to live music. And like, I've seen Metallica from like 15 feet away, and then seeing them on a screen, I was like, well, this is an adaptation, I guess, right. is all you can ask for. And I think we're, that adaptation paired with problem solving, I think gets us pretty far. Obviously, it will never get us back to what was before this, but there's at least opportunity in that.
Well, and my hope has been all along that to that point of the acceleration of what it would have taken 30 years is that what we've done now maybe is we've problem solved through trial and error in this very acceptable incubator, because we were all just struggling and falling on our faces and trying to make it. And we'll pull out the best parts of these things that we'll then be able to layer back on top of, like, oh, and you can have these in-person experiences again, right? But we learn from this that there's value in these other parts of it. I mean, I saw that thing Metallica did. Just last night I watched, so Alice in Chains was honored for in Seattle, they have like the pop culture museum or whatever, and they have like this big annual thing. And it was really interesting because they usually have their big fundraiser gala for this, and they have an artist that they're honoring with like a lifetime achievement award, and about 250 people who are extremely high dollar donors get to come to this, hear them talk, play a few songs, and then there's some, fundraiser talk, right? Well, because they couldn't do this in person, what they did this year is a digital version where now millions of people get to see, hear the stories, hear the Alice in Chains guys tell their whole journey of like what Seattle means to them and what the scene was at the time. And there's these intimate things interspersed with performances that they did live there. And I almost think that this is enabling a new way of having that personal connection or being behind the veil, that fourth wall that kind of used to be created by the stage. That's kind of what's interesting and neat to me about this, is like it might actually start to become more normal to kind of like have the artist bring you into the experience digitally,
right,
and have it feel more real though.
But the accessibility is just, and I mean that from a cost perspective, from, a location perspective. I grew up, in Cleveland at a time when bands toured through Cleveland. And, if someone was touring, they were coming through Cleveland. There was no doubt about it. That's changed with how the economy has changed and everything. So, now if some bands come over and they play New York and LA and that's it. But if you have the opportunity to watch, a live stream and that's the next best thing, then that accessibility to me is really important. Because I think that one thing I do appreciate about it is that, yes, it removes the veil, and it also like democratizes that. Mm-hmm. So it's less the experience of the privilege, to your point, the high dollar donors to go to this thing. It's now everyone's, experience. And that I think is so important in having this. I think that, and I say this as a person who works for the music industry, but like the ability for more people to access it at a lower price, I think is more valuable. Yeah. The fact that, I, full disclosure, paid a lot of money to see Metallica very close up. I paid way less to go, see them at a drive-in theater. And granted, nothing compares to being in a room, but I will take the next best thing. There's so many examples of this, even outside of work. I used to live in LA. I went to a yoga studio regularly. I had a yoga teacher there that I loved, taking his classes. Have been able to take those classes again during this time, which I can, great for my brain, but also something that was accessible to me now that wasn't for the years I've been living in Philadelphia. And being able to reconnect with people that, especially for me, someone who has kind of moved in these like 5-year little editions, being able to reconnect with people through this and like have those shared experiences again and figure out problem solve ways that we can all be together. Normally I go to the same bar when I go home for the holidays. We did a Zoom instead. So like being able to make these things happen any way that you can, because you're a human being and you need connection. So, yeah. I mean, I can tell you I do. So I never thought I'd miss going to an office so much in my life, but this accessibility, I think, of these kinds of things, I hope continues after this. I think all the time, going into this was so abrupt. Mm-hmm. One day I was going into my office, the next day they were like, the office is closed. You're not going there anymore. And I was like, oh, okay. And so I think all the time about getting into this and how we, to your point, have adapted to the world that we currently live in. Mm-hmm. I think all the time about what coming out of this looks like. Yeah. And to your point, are we layering the things that worked, that benefited us on top of what we used to know? Because I think that rebuilding out of this is going to look different. There's no switch that we're going to flip and like tomorrow I'm going to go to an office and everything's going to be exactly the same. It's just not possible. Yeah. And I think to think that it is kidding ourselves in a way. And I think there will be a lot of problem solving coming out of this. And I think that's, again, like a true opportunity to be able to build the kind of things that we want coming out.
Somewhere around mid to late spring, when you kind of realized like the normal will be redefined, it really started to kind of like create this discomfort of me when people were like, well, when we get back to normal, and then it was the new normal, which still felt a little bit like, yeah, but you're still relying on it being like, it's new because
some factor of what we had. Yes.
Yeah. And so then now I've heard some people start saying things like the next normal. And I'm like, okay, that starts to feel a little bit more approachable as a futurist, right? I'm like, okay, yeah. It's, so we're talking at least about like defining what's next, but the real like intrinsic part of me that wants to say like, okay, let's be optimistic and let's see where we head is leaning really hard into the idea of like, okay, we will learn from this and create a new normal or a next normal or whatever you want to call it, but we will create something new versus like trying to like clamor to get back a hold of what we had before.
Right. I don't see a world in which that happens. And I think of that even in simple terms, prior to this experience, working from home was in some organizations a luxury,
Right.
something that was available as a benefit, perhaps if you had children, perhaps if you had a special arrangement. I would find it hard, especially as a manager of people, to say, well, you can't work from home anymore.
Right. Right.
My teams have proven that they're super productive. They're able to work. I mean, I work with labels in California. I work with labels in New York. I'm in Philadelphia. We have people in Australia. We all work together through this. So it's hard for me to then say to someone, oh, well, yes, we're going to go back to the office from 9 to 6 every day.
Right.
I don't know how that happens. I personally would love to go back to an office from 9 to 6, but I can't make those demands of other people because I know what they're capable of. And I know that we have, again, problem solved for that to be able to do all of this, while being in quarantine together.
Yeah.
So very curious to see what is an office culture like following this? Am I going into the office every day? I don't know. I feel fortunate that I don't have to plan for that immediately. I think there's so much time before that becomes a thing. But again, what is the building back to that or something like that? What does that look like?
Yeah. So, yeah. I mean, and that's just from the work aspect, right? Then there's the societal level too, right? Of like, whether you want to take the touring industry and say like, what's it mean to go to a concert, or you want to take just any aspect of society. And so I did a research project this summer on kind of like what are people's perceptions of what the world will look like after this, and did a bunch of stakeholder interviews. And there was a couple of quotes that just as you were talking, like still stick in my mind because they were so pointed. They like made it into any presentation I gave about this. And one of them was this person who was early in her career. It was actually a DAAP grad, and she's, kind of like cautiously optimistic that this was going to be okay. But one thing she said with such confidence, and it wasn't arrogance, it was just this confidence she said, companies are going to have to prove why we would need to be in the office. Like, prove to me why I need to be there. This worked. Like, we didn't miss a hitch. And I do think there are parts of it that you probably could prove, like, well, I do actually need you here when we're doing this intensive sprint together where we all need to get our hands messy and like, or we're doing field research or whatever. Like, there are times when you still like, well, I can prove to you why that's better in person. Right. But in terms of day to day, like, it is a tough case to say like, well, wait a minute, we were able to keep the train on the tracks before, but now suddenly it won't work unless you're back here sitting in that little 8x8 space,
Exactly. And to me, like I say to my teams all the time, I would love to be able to walk around their desks and look at what they're working on and be able to have those, offhand conversations and do that like unintentional problem solving that you do when you're having those discussions that just don't happen in these circumstances. I have to say, are you available? Can I Zoom you? Are you ready to present? Like all of these little prep things that we have to get to rather than just the casual walkthrough. I can't wait till that's a thing again. But I also know, to your point, I can't make the demand of any of my team members to say, well, you have to be here because I have to check your productivity or whatever. They've demonstrated that they don't need me to do that. And so I think there will be, I'm hoping, societally flexibility in this so that people can live in places that are more affordable for them and be able to work jobs that they truly are talented at, but be in a place that's more financially viable for them.
Yeah. And without the limitation of disruption to your family and things like that. Yeah.
Exactly. As a person who spent 10 years living in New York and LA, I mean, moving to Philadelphia was like coming out of a foreign land. I mean, my boyfriend made fun of me. We drove across the country and we were in Oklahoma and I asked how much the margaritas cost. And he said $5 and my jaw dropped.
Right. Yeah.
And he was just like, welcome to the real world. Like you have been in a, and I love those cities, trust me, I love them very much, but it's not viable for everyone to live in cities like that. I can't imagine. I mean, I was single that entire time. I was very fortunate that I had to worry about just me. Yeah. So I am nervous about, but at the same time, like enjoy the possibility of what is to come and what we will create coming out of this, because I think there, again, is so much opportunity for accessibility and, financial stability and just flexibility that we haven't had because we thought the system was the system and we had to live in it. So,
Yes. Yeah, 100% agree. I was talking to a friend of mine the other night who lives in Portland. He's from Australia, lives in Portland, and works in the footwear industry. So he's got quite a bit of time that he spends in some of these bigger cities
right.
and everything too. And has a young enough daughter that he's like, I'm not going to leave Portland anytime soon. And, this is where home is. But we were just kind of talking about like, what is the future of these cities that used to be able to kind of command a presence of like, nope, we are the epicenter of whatever industry, and you have to come here if you want to play in this space.
Right.
When all of a sudden, again, we've proven that barrier gets broken down, and then there's people who might want to be able to live in Philadelphia because that's where their home is and their family is, or even like, well, I want to stay in Portland because this is where my daughter goes to school, so I'm here for a while, but I'm really qualified for that job in New York, right?
Yep.
So I think it actually ultimately we will see some really positive lifestyle things come from this, but it feels really messy right now. And that's, I'm more and more recognizing how important it is for helping people who haven't seen their way through maybe a cycle. I mean, none of us have lived through this before, but we've,
right.
As you get older, you've lived through some stuff and seen the other side of it.
Yes.
I'm feeling like I've got to help students recognize, like, look, you have to take what you can from this and get to the other side of it with positive things. You're probably experiencing that with younger creatives you're leading, I would imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. I 10 years ago had worked at a company in Cleveland and had a couple of direct reports who I moved, I went to graduate school. I, kept up with them through LinkedIn and kind of knew what they were doing. And I had a student a colleague reach out because she had gotten laid off and she saw that I had changed jobs during this, which I think is also, the fact that there was opportunity is like wild to me. I will,
Right.
There's so much talk about, I'm grateful I have a job, and absolutely I'm grateful I have a job, but I've also been grateful that I have a job since I went through the recession last time and have
Right.
that experience. And so I tried to impart to her, like, yes, this is one of the most challenging times to be a creative. It is also the time where you find the most opportunity. And I think, honestly, in some ways, really find out what you want to be doing.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to go write about all of these topics and talk about all of this stuff and think about music and think about, housing systems and think about all these things that I wasn't doing previously.
Mm-hmm.
But the recession revealed that as a big part of what I enjoy as a creative.
Mm-hmm.
So I understand how hard it is to keep the faith. I was unemployed for 14 months during the, 2008, 2009 recession.
Yeah.
And it is hard. My heart goes out to people. I think that, the one thing that I can say is like, that is something I went through. I lost my job. I was unemployed for a long time. And now, in 10 years of building back from that, now I am in a really great leadership position that I'm very thankful to be in. But that, it came from struggling as a creative, questioning what choices I'd made,
Mm-hmm.
and really working back from that. So I think that, I'm one person, of course, but I think that being, keeping those skills going, designing work for yourself, I was doing random freelance for like random restaurants in Cleveland just to keep myself current and working. But being able to do that stuff, I think is how you kind of survive something like this, because it's so tough, because our skill set, which I think is so valuable in so many applications, particularly, in the corporate world, is usually the first to see shrink and see cutbacks.
Yeah.
I was in the advertising industry when this started, and that, clearly diminished from where it was, similar to what I saw, in 2008, 2009, when budgets that had been massive were cut and things just weren't done the same way anymore, because companies, almost to the same point they were making, companies realized they could do it for less with a leaner budget, less people. And so that, in some ways, that could cut either way. But
Yeah.
I think that it is a tough time, but it's a time where people, to all the points that we've been discussing, like truly tap into opportunity, accessibility, flexibility, all of these things that we may not have seen without having this.
Right. Yeah, and especially I think it's so important for younger people, whether you're in college or at the beginning of your creative career or whatever, to recognize too that we talk a lot about, oh, embrace ambiguity or like be flexible and pivot and all this. But when you go through something like this at a formative time, I think that like drives that into a core part of your DNA that maybe if you were going through this after a 25 or 30-year career, you might kind of just feel shell shocked and be like, I can only pivot so much. Right. But,
right.
But if you live through this, I mean, pre all of this, I remember doing a study and giving a talk on like how AI might disrupt all types of jobs, not just the ones that everybody's afraid of, and sort of the projections of how quickly jobs would start to become created and then others would be cut, in the cycle of that happening. And you start to look at and realize like, okay, so if you're in an undergrad degree program for 4, maybe 5 years, we're headed towards a point where the job that you come in as a first-year student coming out of high school and your guidance counselor suggested, oh, major in this because you can get this kind of job. In that 4 to 5 year cycle of being a student, that very job that you came in intending to do might actually disappear or might change so radically that your skill set that you were trained for no longer prepares you for it, right? So there has to be this mindset shift of I'm going to build a foundational level of skills, and then I'm going to have a toolkit that I use to go after problems with, because the problem's going to keep changing,
Yeah. And in this conversation, I've worked in a lot of industries. There are connections between all of those industries, but they each have their own unique ways that they function, their unique vocabulary, all of those things that I've had to learn every single time. And I don't know if I just love a challenge and want to keep pushing myself in that way, but you do, I started out, my first job, I was designing cards that hair accessories hung on, at CVS.
Yeah.
Now I oversee teams that design something totally different than that. So I think that, again, it's that what I saw myself doing, designing album covers, that has come true in a roundabout way. I am in the music industry. I do, work in those things, but it's not what I saw. And I think being comfortable, I don't even know if it's comfortable with disruption. I think it's human nature to not be comfortable with that. But I think it is being open to uncertainty and knowing, especially when I went through Cincinnati, that's when the internet really became what it is now. And by the time I graduated print design, everyone was like, oh, print design is dead, which will never happen. But, what I had thought was, again, the music, the album art example, what was a cool 12 by 12 book thing, that still happens. But so much of it is, a square on a screen.
Yeah.
And so that all changed. But I think rather than, be disturbed by that, it's again, to your point, how do I take my skills and how do I work on this? How do I still find something in this that I feel passionate about, that I love doing, that I feel adds value to the world? Like, how do I take those skills and do that? And I think that it is hard when you feel there are so few opportunities, but those opportunities come back, just not in the ways you thought they did.
Yeah. Well, and it almost kind of feels like it's another way of the importance of systems thinking too, right? Yeah. Like, because these analogous connections become really important too. Like, oh, okay, we're not running a battle of the bands anymore in person because we can't, but like, what does a battle of the bands do? Like, what's the human experience at one? What are the things we're triggering and tapping into? Okay, how might we turn that same, like, let's pull those same emotional levers for consumers in a different way, maybe, all of that. And that's not something that you necessarily get from a specific major or discipline in college or first job or anything else. It just comes from being adaptable and like flexing those mental muscles enough to be able to do it,
Exactly. This has been a major challenge for me to start a job like this, to oversee teams. I've met approximately 2 of my coworkers in person. This is a big challenge, but again, like, being open to, how do I learn this while doing this? How do I figure this out? What ways can I invent that are some kind of similarity? What is it? I can't do a crit the way I would. How do I do a crit in this space? What does that look like? How do I prep my teams for that? How do I make sure they're comfortable doing that? Being able to think through all those things and problem solve that's applicable no matter what industry I'm in, no matter what I'm doing. All of that, comes into play.
Yeah. So good. Well, no surprise, we were able to find lots of stuff to talk about. Is there anything that we didn't get a chance to talk about that is interesting or important to you?
I feel like we hit a lot of topics. I feel like we touched on most of my pet topics, things that are important to me. And honestly, like I will say, helped me to get to some conclusions that I hadn't even really thought through until talking it through with you. And I think that's, to me, like the benefit of having these kinds of conversations is getting to these places that you didn't even
Right
really
on.
get to. So
Well, we never anticipated a therapeutic element to the show, but maybe that's a thing that this is also showing us, right?
yes, absolutely.
Right on. So cool. Well, Erin, thank you so much. Thanks for your time, and thanks for telling your story, and the level of honesty with even what you're experiencing and transparency. That authenticity goes a long way. So we really appreciate it. Appreciate your time, and would love to stay in touch and
Yeah.
hear what next cool new thing you're going to do. I don't know what your next big thing will be, but and whether it'll be digital or physical or who knows what, right?
Honestly, I couldn't even begin to know. But yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this. Again, I cannot say how much, my education at Cincinnati has contributed to what I've been able to make of myself today, which sounds corny, but is absolutely true. And just really appreciate your time and having the opportunity to do this.
Right on. Cool. Well, thank you for being a part of the show, and thank you everybody who tuned in to check us out. We really appreciate the support for the show, and we appreciate the support we've gotten from Cincinnati Bell to make this possible. So thank you, Cincinnati Bell, and thank you to everybody who's given us suggestions of people to talk to and things to talk about. So if you're watching this show and you've got an idea for a guest that we should connect with, please let us know. If you've got a topic you want us to talk about, please let us know. We look forward to having those conversations. Reach out on social media, and we hope you'll tune in next time. So thanks a lot, and we'll see you then.